Okay, so let's try this out. The code that you're looking at is on screen. Um, it should be, since I'm looking at it, and it appears to be correct. Hopefully, everyone can hear me okay. Uh, I think I need to get closer to the mic, but that's not working out so well. So I need to get like a setup, but I don't really care. So hopefully you guys can hear me without having to turn up your speakers. I think at some point I need to download all the videos that I have and normalize the audio and increase the uh, levels and whatnot. So let's get started. So I was informed that the patch that I submitted for the WP widgets was too complicated, and I'm going to talk about it and try to explain further my thoughts on the patch that I submitted. So um, the idea of creating multiple smaller um, interfaces has to do with interface segregation. Uh, what this means is that you want smaller. Well, okay. What I think it means is that you want smaller interfaces so that you can test for a given interface without having to implement the entire interface. So let's say you have a class and you have let's say you have an interface that has 10 methods. Any class that implements that interface has to have the same 10 methods. And that might be fine if those methods have to be um, it's a part of the contract that you have for that code that uses that interface. So you're using all 10 of those methods, and the code in those methods should be small and contained. That's fine. The reason to have smaller amount of interfaces is so that you could say, for example, um, not only reuse. I talked about this before, but not only reuse interfaces, but to allow classes to implement a small amount of methods so that you don't have a situation where you have to extend a class just because you want to, just because the class is good, except for this one method that you need to change. Everything else is great. You want to have it to where you can create classes that implement those interfaces and then compose them together to create your solution. So you can reuse classes that implement a single interface in with your other classes. So you can create a class that implements all of the interfaces, which um, for the most part, I implement. I have a single class that implements all of the interfaces, and then my goal is to go in and replace functionality by having a class implement one or few of the interfaces and replacing the implementation of the base class with the second class or with the other classes. So I can compose together multiple classes that have an implementation, and doing this, I think, is much cleaner because you have a class that does one thing, does it well, and you reuse that class anywhere where that interface is accepted. So this is a rough draft. This is my goal. This is what I'm trying to show. It's not really what's going to be in the final product. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. I haven't decided. I don't really know the entire specifications of a WP widget, and I need to go over. This is just simply taking what exists and sort of refactoring it out and abstracting out the code to where hopefully it's a little bit cleaner. Hopefully it makes a lot more sense. But I've been told that it's too complicated. Um, I'm trying to. I'm going to try to explain what I'm attempting to do with my patch. So I created this interface that is the admin interface. What I would like to do really is to have a WP widget, or technically, what I want to do is have a WP a display interface that has a render, let's just say. And sorry. So what? And then basically, what is returned is the render interface, and you can reuse this render interface anywhere. That's all it does. Is just return a view. Um, well, I mean, technically, it's going, yeah, rendering. You're rendering to the screen. So I would like to call it display, but I think most, well, I think calling it display. Well, okay. So you have this attempts to follow the PSR naming guidelines that exist. There you go. So this is a generic interface that can be reused anywhere. Sorry, I meant to say. Come on, come on. Okay, 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 okay. All right, there you go. So um, that's what I mean. So a render is called. It displays the content to the screen automatically, and that's render. All right. So what I would like to do technically is to say a form would be a it would be rendered. So you would this would return a WP display interface that would be rendered, which it still might be able to technically. Um, I guess it's still possible. But the problem with form is that its implementation not only returns a string, but it also displays. So it has so it has two things that it does, which is um, not quite proper. It should do one thing, and it does two. So it returns a string as well as echo, as well as render. So this will be changed to just return a string, which the problem is that given that it has two things that are coupled to it, you can't just simply um, redo that. You can't simply redo a form. It has to always display as well as return a string. And that's sort of the problem is that while I would like to use this, and the finished code most likely will use that interface, um, right now trying to decouple as well as remove and abstract out the current code, it's sort of a mess. I mean, I think part of the problem is that I have multiple interfaces given the current WP widget implementation. And what I should really just do is create specific interfaces and then create a new implementation, which I think I might do. Um, that's sort of where I'm going. I'm heading towards is creating a separate implementation and um, uh, refactoring the current implementation to use the new. So it doesn't quite get rid of the old, but all the code that actually deals with widgets will use the new code. So trying to decouple and transition to that. But I mean, part of the refactoring is getting a grasp of what exists and how to change it for the better, because you don't want as many. So you only want one interface that does display rendering. You don't want multiple interfaces like I have, and I will show later on, that does display. That's not what you want. You want simply one interface, and that's it. You want to reuse that interface as much as possible. That's the goal. So form is one of them. Widget title, I think, returns that is accurate. So as well as the WP widget display interface. So the part of it is that while looking at the code, the new patches for the ticket have something where they want to take the current widget method and break it out into a pre and a post, as well as the content. So they want a before and after and the content, and break that out, as well as have a method that tests whether or not the widget should be displayed. But the existing and the new both have something called a widget title that is necessary for both contracts. So down here, this is the current one. It just has a widget, which has it displays the content. Really, this should be a render as well. But yeah, it requires the widget title contract as part of it, as well as the new, which also requires the widget title method. And my hope is that essentially what this should be is that if you have one or the other or both, it will still satisfy the widget display title interface. So you could implement both the WP widget display event interface as well as the WP widget display interface. I hope I said WP widget display event interface, and not duplicated the same thing. But anyway, so you can have both of these interfaces implemented in your class, and you only need to have one of these, and it will just work. Hopefully that's the way PHP does its method conflict resolution. And here's that interface. I think part of the problem is that the people who created the implementation, they want to say, well, I just want to have a class that has this. I just want to have a class that has this. I just want to have a class that might have this. So I want to be able to implement this and this, but not that. I mean, that's perfectly fine. But that does create, like, instead of having one interface, you would have potentially four. But again, each one of these should be render. Should have a render interface. It shouldn't have three methods that display stuff. And that's sort of where it should go. This should be one. This interface should only have one. Verify settings, and name would probably be changed. But as well as this would go away, essentially. But the problem is there still needs to be a contract that describes all of these methods, because the widget that currently exists has a contract that must be met, and you need to have a interface that satisfies that contract. Um, that can be called. So bringing it down further, I might just smash all of these interfaces together to match the current implementation, and then create smaller interfaces that are more generic, that simply um, complement the implementation that currently exists. So instead of having um, interfaces that do the same thing, have a few small interfaces that do a very specific thing. Whereas having one interface that defines the current legacy um, contract and just implement that. So that would be a lot simpler. It'd be a pain, but going towards interfaces, I think, is where WordPress should go, and hopefully, eventually, this will be a example of how to develop patches in the future. But I think starting with the WP widget and going on towards WP site and WP network would be sort of hopefully describe what I'm attempting a lot better um, in the future. So yeah, I mean, it was essentially, um, trying to prove an example, a trivial one, but still to show how where I'm going. Although it might have been too obtuse or too abstract to comprehend, because I know what I think, but other people don't know what I think. So that might have been the problem. Most definitely might have been. So the WP widget settings is a new interface. It's not part of the old contract that exists. And WP widget control interface, I'm probably going to extend and sort of move the legacy to this, um, or simply have it as a base, and then have the other interfaces, both the old as well as the new, extend that. Just have it an empty interface. And what that does, what that attempts to do, is simply create a type. So you have a WP widget control interface type that you can type hint on methods and functions, that describes what the um, um, what the object is. So it doesn't have any methods, which some of the common methods might be moved to it, but it just says, I accept any widget. All right. It doesn't specify um, what the contract is, so it's not that useful. But if you just want a generic widget, this is what you would use, define as a type hint, or what you would check the instance of. And this is a implementation of one of the interfaces, and all it does is simply pull the existing code out of WP widget and puts it into a separate class, um, which can be composed together. And that's sort of what I'm trying to show, is composition, taking smaller classes and composing them together to give you a single better class. And I think the problem was that I didn't quite go into how you would compose um, using all of these smaller classes. I gave a brief example, but not a complete one, and I think that might have been my mistake. Simply not showing how you would use WP Widget admin form missing, which I started as a stub, um, but it might need to be name probably needs to be changed. So WP Widget display empty is an example of um, simply what they're attempting to do. So this is also again existing code that exists, and it shows the basically the implementation of what it would look like. Technically, this should probably be abstract and make uh, this abstract. And there you go. So all all you need to do is to put your markup, your display in the widget markup, and you'll be done. So the purpose that I'm trying to go into is don't extend classes. Don't so, but I mean, composing this would be before widget method would be in a separate class. Um, After widget would be in a separate class, so on and so forth. So that might be the a mistake um, that I'm going with. So, um, but yeah, I mean, this should really be abstract. People should be extending from this because it does require some modifications. Like if your property exists, ID base, which you wouldn't be able to do with a final. Um, so on and so forth. I think so. The ticket people with the ticket still want to be able to extend classes using the extend keyword, whereas I'm trying to move it towards move it towards composition. But showing that's going to be a bit difficult at this point until more code is written. WP Budget settings is an attempt to go in and remove or decouple the rest of the code in WP Widget into separate classes and then calling those classes. So at the moment, I think I'm going to simply um, hard couple it. But eventually, I want to get to the point where I'm using an interface and I'm decoupling it from. I'm using dependency inversion and decoupling the WP widget setting to an interface so that anything that implements that interface can be accepted. And that's where I hope to go. But I mean, simply moving the methods out of this class and calling this class as opposed to having the code hard coded would be a advantage. And then simply going from there. How do I create a new implementation that is clean, that implements all of this, and does a good job doing it? So that's where I'm going to go in the future. But simply, also, this kind of shows the usage of the interface. So a WP widget right now implements all of the contracts, except for the ones that I'm removed. So technically, the base WP widget it uh, it implements WP widget display interface and WP widget admin interface are the two known ones. I haven't gone back and implemented settings, but I'm going to do that eventually. I spent an hour, possibly an hour and a half, to 2 hours working on this. So it's just a really brief look at it, and so all of these methods down here. Um, hmm, um, so that's going to be a separate contract widget, widget title, update, form. That's its own interface. Or, I mean, simply, well, no, I think I'm going to extend some of the ones that I have currently and create a new interface. From that, it sort of takes all of the existing ones and creates a one big gigantic one, and then extend that or implement that instead of multiple smaller pieces. Um, and then the ones down here, all of these will be separated into separate classes and then called in these methods. So essentially, the way it's going to go is that these methods are going to be just one line, going to call, or possibly a few lines after I move towards a more registry type implementation. Ah, fuck. So that is sort of where I want to go with it, and explain sort of what I attempt to do. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's a lot of code, and it's very coupled. So what I'm gonna have to do is actually take some of these and break them out into their own interface and accept that as well. Um, Attempt to find a pattern and create an interface that implements that pattern. um, Preferably a one that is generic enough that could be called in many different places. And that I think is possible. It does seem like these sort of have a specific pattern that can be broken out into a interface and then called. So that'll be the attempt. But first things first, I have to break all of this code out into separate classes and then sort of comprehend what it all does from there. But it does seem like one thing I've noticed that a problem kind of is that um, I'm doing I'm going from one extension point to another. So right now, callbacks are used heavily, and that needs to maintain. So whatever contract I implement needs to maintain the current callback extension points. So those shouldn't really change, and they must not change. And that's sort of going to be an issue is that I might have to proxy. So whatever interface I ultimately accept, it might have to be proxied through separate classes that actually call those callback extension points so that the contract is maintained regardless of the implementation and also yeah, so basically you don't have to worry about the callback extension points with your implementation. All you care about is the specifics, the implementation that the contract requires, and the callback extension points will still be implemented, and any code that depends on that will still work regardless of whatever replacement that exists. So that will have to be pushed in as well. And then sort of going through the code and ultimately attempting to clean it up a little bit. So um, again, once I get to the factory, this is going to have to be. I'm probably going to create a registry generic class and reuse it in here as well as for the implementation of the widget implementations. But I think the problem is going to be that is that um, basically that registry should be global and in a separate ticket. So I really hate to have a registry um, with just the widgets, but I hope to sort of name it well enough to where it can be reused. So it'll probably be in this file, but I hope to eventually be able to reuse it elsewhere. So I don't know. And then getting rid of these globals will definitely be something as well. Unfortunately, the globals will still have to probably exist. Unfortunately, and then the next step would be to go through all. Well, I created this function actually. It doesn't have any PHP doc, which it should, and it will. Um, but yeah, go through all of these, and technically, this is actually what I'm going to do with the rest of these. So basically, all of these functions will call a class that exists, and yeah. Um, so yeah, and then use a registry for that, um, so on and so forth. And I think having the registry class be generic enough to where it could accept a contract or an interface or simply accept anything, and that's something to be part of it as well. And once all of the implementations are fully broken out, sort of realize how it could be improved. So the next step is to take the existing code, break it out into separate classes. The step after that will be to create a registry and then register all the classes with that registry and get rid of the globals and use the registry wherever it's necessary. Um, and yeah, I mean that's essentially it. Um, I don't really get the argument that it's too complicated. I think if we haven't used any interfaces before, interfaces are new. It's just like, hey, I have to now implement this interface, and it's just like, well, I don't want to. I just want to implement this, or I just want to extend this class, implement the methods that I have to, and then move on. And okay, um, I think it's fine. Uh, for the most part, I don't want to force people to actually read the code. The point of API is to not force someone to um, do it a specific way. I think the problem with APIs is they want the best APIs allow you to they abstract out the implementation. So they allow you to very simply, very easily replace content without even realizing that you're replacing content or the implementation. And that is really what it should be. And that's the goal, to move towards that. But I mean, the problem is to implement that where it's one layer above. You don't want to have multiple layers above the base implementation. Uh, the reason for that is, oh, what was the reason for that? Abstracting out to trying to abstract out too far creates a situation where testing is more difficult, and you you want your abstractions um, to as much as possible display or teach how to use the base implementation. So if someone has to, they can go to your base implementation and understand how to do it from your implementation, your abstraction of the base implementation. Having to go two or more just adds too many layers of complexity. And when I say complexity, I mean even though the code is simpler to use, possibly the base implementation, you don't really gain anything from the base implementation. So it's sort of like using factories. When you have a factory shows you how to put together the classes and how that all works. Going beyond that sort of destroys the point of a factory. You have a factory of factories, which is sort of proof that your implementation is too too complex. So you should be implementing a solution that is self-contained. When you have something that requires a factory of a factory, your solution's too coupled. You have too many dependencies within your package, and that sort of breaks what I'm attempting to go towards. And the code that I have, I think, doesn't improve that much. WP display interface sort of goes where I want to go and take it. But the biggest problem is sort of going back and implementing it in a backwards compatible way. And that should be possible, like, technically, using the WP display interface. I mean, really, I'm guessing um, which I mean, this code, uh, fuck, as well as um, hmm, then attempt to so I'm thinking this is sort of what they want. Um, so you have four interfaces, and one says render whatever you have. Before interface will say before render, after render, and should I render with the verify interface. And this is sort of like breaks it out. So if I implement WP display before interface, I'm saying that call this method if it exists, and then after interface will call this method after render is called. So what I would then have is, and let's see if this sort of goes into the oh crap. Oh fuck. Oh man. Oh, this is disgusting. And then let's hmm. 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 So what I'm saying here is um, sort of describing the contract. I'm saying if the class that extends this class implements WP display before interface, call this before um, render. All right. So, um, and that should possibly satisfy it. So, the technically the class is already abstract, given that it doesn't define should render. So that really should be part of any class that extends this. Which I mean, actually, I think technically I have to do that just to say that. Just to say that this is intentionally left out, left for the person who extends this. So this class technically does what they're talking about. And the nice thing about it is that it does it anywhere. Anywhere. is not restricted to simply WP widgets. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, is that you want to create interfaces that are generic. Having something that is specific exists, of course. In practice, you're going to have a implementation that is specific. It has a contract um, um, with that implementation, of course, and you're going to have interfaces that go along with that. But by having generic interfaces as much as possible, you can reuse interfaces. I can reuse this anywhere. I can extend it or reuse it anywhere. So it's not specific to WP widgets, and that's sort of what I think. What I think the problem is with WordPress code is that it's more like instead of going through and trying to create code that is generic that can be reused anywhere, it's more I have this problem. I'm going to code until the solution is met. And this is much cleaner. This is much cleaner. So I can have multiple interfaces that do one thing. I can have a abstract class that can be extended if that's so, if you so wish, whatever, and done. So anyone that it extends this class can implement WP display before it will be called. They can sorry, let me fix that. This right here, copy and paste. Which technically, if you want to do this better, you would have let's just say there's ways to do this better, but it requires more code. So also, I'm kind of fond of naming methods where if you have the contract can have multiple, so you can have a WP widget before to give a example of both of what you shouldn't do, possibly, as well as what you could do. So a WP widget before would have before widget. So you can have before render as well as before widget, both in the same class. And that's sort of unfortunate with PHP. Go's type system is much, much better. You just implement that interface. You don't have to actually specify whether or not you implement it. Anything that matches that, I'm going to say contract, just gets that interface regardless. I hope I said regardless. But yeah, I mean, that I think is the extent. This is where I want to go with not only WordPress, but well, I should say not only WP widget, but with WordPress, and that'd be much, much better, I think. So I'm gonna end this and have a good day. Leave any feedback you might have. Especially, I think the good parts of this is I'm learning how to simplify and explain what I want. And going forward, hopefully, I do a better job of it. Give better examples. One thing I like about working with WordPress is that there's so much room for improvement. I can learn, and hopefully other people can learn from me. But I think part of the problem is that I put forth all the effort to learn, to experience, gain the experience, whereas someone who comes after doesn't. They might. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think the example is the PHP doc in WordPress. I did all of this work prior to spending time going through and doing PHP documentation, inline documentation, and I went back and redid a lot of the PHP doc that I written previously. Um, Thankfully, it wasn't a whole lot at that point, but I built up to a solution that worked. Um, but part of it was that I had a reason to use specific tags for, for for a reason, but I don't think I explained what reasons those were, and I don't think I did a good enough job. And I think had I think part of this is to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing, so that anyone who comes after, if they are interested in the knowledge that knowledge and experience that I was able to gather, and the research, the conclusions I was able to come up with, it might better further their contributions to WordPress, provided that any of the shit that I'm doing is actually um, committed to WordPress core, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be. And I think that is part of the problem. But I have my own fork of WordPress, and I think after I do enough work that possibly um, it could be accepted. Probably not, but I think you have to take baby steps with WordPress. You can't just like slam it all in, because there's too many people with there's too many people in the room to be heard. Even if you're shouting, there's too many people, and being able to convince one or a few of them doesn't really matter, because you have to not only convince, well, I mean, if you can convince someone that has commit status, um, that could commit to the project, then you have a foot through the door. But I mean, that's it. Only works if everything works out. Um, it has to work, and that's the thing. And I'm hoping that with the test cases that I'll be writing, that I could prove that it works better than with the WP HTTP classes. Better prove, and any edge cases that are sure to come up will be satisfied with a test case, with the test suite. And I mean, having unit tests will hopefully um, improve sort of the stability of a WordPress. Being able to go in and say this code works at this level, and it works at this level. Of course, you need to have integration tests and to sort of go into that. And one of the things I want to experiment with is quick tests. So sort of put that in there, actually generate not really code, but generate values, um, and then see what the values break. This functionality already kind of exists with PHP unit, but I don't think quick. Um, I don't think the automated generation is really part of it. So um, I think I'm done at this point. I've said all that I need to say. So I'm gonna end this for certain, like right now, for sure. So thanks for listening and watching. And again, if you have any feedback, any improvements of what I've done, any suggestions, please let me know.